party had checked his watch 11 times. I had counted. I was preparing to issue a default judgment. A default judgment means the absent party loses automatically. Calvin Merritt was about to lose his case without anyone hearing a word of it. And then the door opened. The man who walked in was 67 years old. He was breathing hard, not the mild breathlessness of someone who walked quickly from the parking garage, but the deep, sustained effort of a person who had been moving fast for an extended period and whose body was still processing it. His jacket had a damp patch across the left shoulder. He had a manila folder tucked under his right arm, bent at the corner, the kind of bend that happens when a folder gets pressed against something urgently and there is no time to straighten it. He looked at me from the doorway with the eyes of a man who understood exactly what walking into a courtroom 2 hours late looked like and who had come anyway because the alternative was something he could not do. He said, "Your Honor, I apologize for the time. I know what 2 hours means. I can explain, and if you will let me. In 40 years, I have heard many explanations for lateness. Traffic, parking, wrong building, alarm. Most of them are true in some technical sense, and beside the point in every meaningful one. A court date is a court date." Something about the way this man stood at that door, the breathing, the damp jacket, the bent folder, and above all, the steadiness of his eyes, which were not the eyes of someone embarrassed, but the eyes of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to stand behind it, told me that what I was about to hear was different. I said, "Sit down, Mr. Merritt. The court will hear your explanation." Stafford looked at me. I looked back at him. He looked at his folder. "Stay with me." Because what Calvin Merritt had been doing since 8:20 that morning is not what you are expecting. And it is the reason this case ended the way it did. Calvin Merritt had served in the United States Army for 22 years. He had enlisted at 18, done 3 deployments, 2 in the Gulf, 1 in Iraq, and retired at 40 as a staff sergeant. The military had given him many things: discipline, the ability to function under pressure, the understanding that documentation is not bureaucracy but protection. It had also given him a left knee that had never fully recovered from a vehicle rollover in Fallujah in 2004, and that he managed with a brace and a particular way of walking that you noticed if you watched him cross a room. He had come home to the city where he grew up. He had found work as a building supervisor for Harrington Residential Properties, a job that suited him in the way that jobs sometimes suit people, not because it was prestigious or well paid, but because it matched what he was. He was methodical. He was reliable. He was the person you called at 2 a.m. when the boiler failed or the ceiling was leaking, and he would come and he would fix it, and in the morning there would be documentation of what had been done and when. He had done this job for 17 years. He lived alone in a 1-bedroom on the east side. He had been married briefly in his late 30s. The deployments had taken more than his knee. He had no children. His closest people were his sister Gloria, who called every Sunday without fail, and the residents of the buildings he managed, several of whom were elderly and lived alone and had, over 17 years, come to think of Calvin as something between a maintenance supervisor and the person who would notice if something was wrong. The case before me was a wrongful termination claim. Calvin had been dismissed 8 months earlier by Harrington Residential Properties, the company that had employed him for 17 years, 3 weeks after filing a formal complaint with the city's housing department about conditions in several units the company managed. The complaint had cited mold, inadequate heating, and a rodent problem in 3 apartments, all occupied by elderly tenants on fixed incomes. The company had responded by placing Calvin on a performance improvement plan within a week of the complaint and terminating him 2 weeks after that. He was representing himself. He had a folder of documentation. He had filed his own claim, written his own summary, organized his evidence in the careful way of a man who had spent 22 years understanding that paperwork and documentation are what stand between you and chaos. The plaintiff, or rather the defendant in his claim, was Harrington Residential Properties, represented by an attorney named Neil Stafford, who had been waiting since 9:30 with the mounting irritation of someone who considered Calvin Merritt's lateness a personal discourtesy. I looked at Stafford. I said, "We are going to hear Mr. Merritt's explanation before we proceed." Stafford looked at his watch. I said, "Counselor, your watch is not relevant to my courtroom. Please put it away." He put it away. Calvin looked at me. He took one breath, then he began. He said, "Your Honor, I left my apartment at 7:45 this morning. My hearing was at 9:30. I'd given myself enough time. I was on the number 14 bus heading downtown when my phone rang at 8:20. He said, "It was a resident from my old building. Her name is Ida Voss. She is 79 years old. I managed her building for 11 years before I was terminated. She was calling because her upstairs neighbor, an 82-year-old man named George Pulaski, had not answered his door that morning when she knocked to check on him. She had been knocking for 40 minutes. She could hear his television, but he wasn't answering, and she was frightened. He said, I got off at the next stop. I called 911 immediately. I want to be clear about that. It was my first action. I gave the dispatcher the address and described what Ida had told me. The dispatcher took the information and told me there was a 45-minute to 1-hour response time for non-emergency welfare checks. He stopped for just a moment. He said, I know George Pulaski. I managed his building for 11 years. I know he is 82 years old and lives alone and has a cardiac history. I know what 45 minutes can mean for someone in that situation on a cold floor. I made a calculation and I got on a bus going the other direction. He said, I reached the building at 8:51. The building manager, the person who replaced me, was not on site. I still had my emergency contact information for several residents, including the unit beside George's. I got that neighbor to let me into the corridor, and I knocked. When there was no response, I asked the building manager to be called. He arrived at 9:07. We entered the unit. He said George was on his bathroom floor. He had fallen sometime between 5 and 6 in the morning, approximately 3 hours. His phone was on the kitchen counter. He had experienced what the paramedics later described as a mild cardiac event during or shortly after the fall. His heart had responded to the stress and the cold and the time on the floor. He was conscious when I reached him. He was disoriented and cold, and he was frightened. He said, I sat on the floor beside him, and I held his hand, and I talked to him until the paramedics arrived at 9:34. I stayed until they had him stabilized and loaded. They took him at 9:41. I went to the waiting room, and at 10:05, I reached the hospital floor nurse and confirmed he was stable and being assessed. Then I got in a cab. He said, I know what time it is. I know what 2 hours means to this proceeding. I am telling you because I think you should know and because I would make the same choice again. He looked at me steadily. He said, I know I am 2 hours late. I know what that means procedurally, but I could not leave George Pulaski on that floor and come here. I could not do it. I understand if the court rules against me because of the time. I needed you to know why. The courtroom was absolutely silent, not the polite silence of people waiting for the next procedural step, the held complete silence of a room that has just heard something and is processing it. Neil Stafford had stopped looking at his watch. I looked at Calvin Merritt for a long moment. I looked at the damp jacket and the bent folder and the steady eyes of a man who had chosen at 8:20 in the morning between his own case and an 82-year-old man on a bathroom floor. He had chosen George Pulaski, and then he had gotten in a cab and come here anyway because this mattered too, and he was not willing to let it go either. I said, Mr. Merritt, this court is not going to issue a default judgment against you. The hearing will proceed. Stafford started to rise. I said, Counselor, sit down. He sat. Now, before I tell you what happened when we got to the actual case, I need you to do something. If you believe that what Calvin Merritt did at 8:20 this morning, getting off a bus and going back for an 82-year-old man instead of coming to protect his own interest, if you believe that is exactly the kind of person we need more of in this world, type justice in the comments right now. Let me see you, and subscribe to this channel before we go further. Because what Calvin had in that bent folder, the documentation he had put together while representing himself against a company with a lawyer, is something I want you to see. He had been doing what he always did, paying attention, writing things down. And one of the things he had written down was something Harrington Residential Properties had not known he had. Stay with me. I asked Calvin to present his case. He opened the folder. Despite its bent cover, inside everything was organized. Dated tabs, one for each month of the relevant period. He had kept records the way a building supervisor keeps records, methodically because the job requires it, because when something goes wrong at 2 a.m., you need to be able to tell exactly what was done and when. He walked me through the timeline. The mold complaint in Unit 4B, first reported by the tenant, Mrs. Rosa Figueroa, age 76, in September. Calvin had submitted the work order through the company's system on September 14th. He had followed up on September 21st, September 28th, and October 5th. Each follow-up was in his records, time-stamped by the company's own maintenance management software. The work had not been done. He had then filed the formal complaint with the City Housing Department on October 12th. The complaint covered Unit 4B, Unit 2A, and the common area basement, 3 separate documented conditions, each with photographs he had taken himself with his phone. On October 19th, 7 days after the complaint, he had been placed on a performance improvement plan. On November 9th, 28 days after the complaint, he had been terminated. The termination letter cited poor documentation practices and failure to follow company protocols. I looked at the documentation in front of me, Calvin Merritt's documentation, the time-stamped work orders, the follow-up records, the photographs. I said, "Mr. Merritt, the termination letter cites poor documentation as the reason for your dismissal." He said, "Yes, Your Honor." I said, "You have submitted 17 months of time-stamped documentation organized by date and category." He said, "Yes, Your Honor." I said, "Does Harrington Residential Properties use a company-wide maintenance management system that automatically records when work orders are submitted and followed up?" He said, "Yes, Your Honor. It is called ServiceTrack. Every entry I made is logged with my employee ID and a timestamp. The company has access to all of it." I turned to Neil Stafford. I said, "Counselor, your client cited documentation failures as the basis for termination. I am looking at 17 months of time-stamped records in the company's own system. I would like you to show me the documentation failures." Stafford went through his binder. He went through it again. He conferred quietly with someone on his phone. I gave him the time because I wanted to be thorough. He said, "Your Honor, the performance issues related to verbal communication and responsiveness, not the written records." I said, "The termination letter specifically cites documentation. Those are the stated grounds. If you are now telling me the actual grounds were different from the stated grounds, that is a significant problem for your client." He said, "Your Honor, I would need to confer with my client." I said, "You may have 15 minutes. He took